All right, so we're back, and wow, it's election night. And I don't know about you, but I am glued to the results right now.
It's definitely a night for staying up late, refreshing those results pages.
Absolutely. And while everyone else is kind of watching those main results, we're going to do what we do best here at the Deep Dives. We're going to dive into some sources that you might not be looking at and see if we can find some of those like hidden gems, those little details that tell a different story.
The stuff that's maybe falling through the cracks.
Exactly, yeah. And tonight, we've got our eyes on some live updates from a Spanish language news source, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, we don't always get that perspective right.
Yeah, we're so focused on the English language coverage that it's easy to miss what other folks are seeing and thinking about. So tonight, think of us as your like personal cheat sheet to understanding not just who's winning, but like what's really going on beneath the surface. What are the anxieties? What are those little details that might be missed in the mainstream coverage?
Those turning points that could make all the difference.
Exactly. Yeah, those little ripples that could turn into tsunamis,
Yeah.
you know. And speaking of like intense races, this one is definitely living up to the hype. Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, it's neck and neck.
It really is a nail-biter this time around. And the sources are really emphasizing just how close it is. I mean, it could genuinely come down to a handful of those swing states.
Usual suspects, right? Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada.
Exactly, the ones we always end up talking about at the end of the night.
But here's what I find interesting. Even though Trump is racking up wins in some of those like expected places, those strongholds like Florida and Texas.
Right, those are pretty much givens at this point.
Yeah. But the margins in some traditionally Democratic areas are like way closer than anyone predicted. Like it's making everyone nervous.
A lot of people are surprised by that, for sure.
Yeah. And get this, Trump actually won Miami-Dade County.
Whoa, that is huge. That's been a Democratic stronghold for I don't know how long.
Right, decades.
Yeah.
So what do you think that tells us? Like, is this a sign of some kind of a bigger shift happening?
It could be. Some analysts are saying this could be because some Hispanic voters, particularly Cuban Americans, are maybe starting to lean away from the Democrats.
Really? Why is that?
They're pointing to some concerns about socialism and the economy as driving factors in that shift.
Oh, wow. So Miami-Dade could be like a canary in the coal mine, like a little warning sign that things might be changing in a bigger way than we realize.
Exactly. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
For sure. And it's not just the presidency that's up for grabs tonight, right?
Yeah.
We've got those congressional races, too, and those are looking pretty intense.
No, absolutely. Controlling the House and Senate is going to be crucial for whoever wins the presidency.
Because it determines if they can actually get anything done right.
Exactly. It's all about the balance of power. If one party controls both chambers and the White House, they can pretty much bulldoze their agenda through. But if we end up with a divided Congress, which is looking more likely by the minute...
Oh, really?
Yeah, based on these early counts, it seems like Republicans might take control of both the House and the Senate.
Wow, that would definitely shake things up in Washington.
Big time. It would make it really tough for the next president to get anything done. We could be looking at gridlock city.
Yikes. Okay, so we've got a nail-biter presidential race, congressional races that are like on a nice edge. But amidst all this craziness, there are some bright spots.
Oh, absolutely. Some history-making wins, for sure.
I'm talking about Sarah McBride's victory. She is now the first openly transgender congresswoman in U.S. history.
Such a powerful moment and such a powerful symbol of progress.
Absolutely. And speaking of breaking barriers, let's not forget about Jennifer Gonzalez. She's on track to become the second woman to be elected governor of Puerto Rico.
Another fantastic victory, and it just adds another layer of historical significance to this already wild night.
Yeah, it really does. But, as exciting as those wins are, I have to admit, reading through these horses, I'm getting this feeling of anxiety.
Yeah, I can definitely sense that too. There's a real tension in the air.
Like this undercurrent of worry.
I think a lot of it stems from fear of potential violence after the election.
Especially given what happened in 2020, right? With Trump refusing to accept the results.
Exactly. People are worried that could happen again.
And it's not just like a vague feeling either. I mean, the sources are talking about like heightened security in Washington, D.C. Businesses are boarding up their storefronts. It's like everyone's bracing themselves for something.
It's definitely a visual reminder of how on edge everyone is.
And it's not just domestic tensions we have to worry about, right? These reports of foreign interference are adding another layer of like complexity to this already tense situation.
Yeah, these reports of Russian agents spreading false bomb threats, those are really concerning.
Especially since they seem to be targeting polling stations in predominantly black Democratic-leaning districts in Georgia.
Right. It echoes the interference we saw back in 2016 and 2020, and it raises some serious questions about election security and integrity.
It's like a ghost from elections past coming back to haunt us. And speaking of things that could really mess with the results, our sources mention these two terms, red mirage and blue shift.
Oh, yeah, those are important to understand, especially in a close race like this.
So break it down for us. What do those even mean?
Well, the red mirage basically refers to the fact that early results might look like they favor Republicans, making the electoral map look all red, even if that's not actually how the final vote is going to go.
How does that happen?
Because in-person votes, which tend to lean Republican, are often counted first, so you get this early surge of red, but it might not be representative of the overall vote.
Oh, so it's like a false lead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the blue shift comes into play as mail-in ballots and votes from urban areas, which typically lean Democratic, start getting tallied later in the night.
So those could swing the results back towards the Democrats.
Precisely. So it's really important not to jump to conclusions based on those early numbers.
I can already imagine some people trying to claim victory based on that early red mirage, even though it might not mean anything in the end.
It's definitely a possibility, and it highlights the importance of waiting for all the votes to be counted before making any definitive statements.
Patience is key tonight, it seems.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so we've got these potential mirages, shifts, anxieties, foreign interference.
Yeah.
What else should we be paying attention to tonight?
Well, the Latinx vote is getting a lot of attention, especially in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania always seems to be the center of the universe on election night.
It does, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But for good reason, it's a crucial swing state. And this year, the Latinx vote in Pennsylvania's Latino belt could be especially decisive.
What is the Latino belt? I've never heard that term before.
It's a region in southeastern Pennsylvania with a large and growing Latinx population. It includes cities like Allentown, Reading, Lancaster, and both campaigns have been heavily targeting voters there.
So those votes could really tip the scales in Pennsylvania.
They absolutely could.
Wow, every vote really does count in these swing states.
That's the truth.
Okay, so I have a question that I think a lot of people are probably wondering about right now. How do news organizations like the Associated Press call races so early? Like before all the votes are even counted?
Yeah, it seems like magic, doesn't it?
It really does. Like,
Yeah.
how do they know?
Well, it's not magic, but it is a pretty sophisticated process.
Yeah.
They use a combination of exit polls, which they conduct as people are leaving polling places, and precinct results, which start coming in early.
Okay, so they're getting data from actual voters as they leave the polls.
Exactly. And they also use statistical models based on historical data and demographic trends to make projections.
So it's like a data-driven guessing game, but like a really, really informed one.
Exactly. They're piecing together a puzzle using all these different pieces of information to get the most accurate picture possible.
That's fascinating. So they're not just pulling these predictions out of thin air.
Nope, it's a lot of science and analysis goes into those calls.
Okay, so we kind of know how they do it, but what about the why? What are the big issues that are motivating people to vote this year?
Well, the AP VoteCast findings are giving us some insights into that. And it seems like there's a real tension between voters who are mostly focused on the economy and voters who are worried about the future of democracy itself.
It's like two different Americas with two different sets of priorities.
It is, and it really highlights those deep divisions that we've been talking about.
Yeah, some people are worried about putting food on the table, keeping their jobs, making ends meet. And others are worried about, like, the erosion of democratic norms, the attacks on institutions, like the very foundations of our system.
And both of those concerns are completely valid. It's just a matter of which one feels more urgent to each individual voter.
It makes you wonder if those two groups even feel like they're part of the same country anymore.
It's a tough question and one that we might not have an answer to tonight.
Yeah. But it's definitely something to think about. And speaking of big issues, we can't forget about abortion rights, which are actually on the ballot in several states tonight.
That's right. The outcome of those votes could have a massive impact on reproductive health care access for years to come.
It's a reminder that elections aren't just about picking a president. They're about shaping the future of the country, making decisions about the values we want to uphold.
Absolutely, every vote matters.
Okay, so before we wrap up this first part of our election night deep dive, there's one more thing we have to talk about. The elephant in the room.
Oh yeah, the big one.
Trump's recent legal troubles. I mean, it's pretty wild to have a candidate running for president who was literally just convicted of a crime.
It's definitely unprecedented. Earlier this year, Trump was convicted of falsifying business records, which you'd think would disqualify someone from holding public office.
Right, it's not exactly a glowing recommendation.
But because of how the laws work in both Florida and New York, he's still eligible to vote and run for president.
It's kind of a head-scratcher, isn't it?
It is. It's a very unique situation.
But it definitely adds another layer of intrigue to this already crazy election.
Yeah.
And as we head into the final hours leading up to the results, both campaigns are pulling out all the stops, trying to sway those last few undecided voters.
Yeah, it's all about those final pushes.
So what are they doing? What are the strategies in these last few hours?
Well, they're taking very different approaches. Harris is focusing on personal connections, doing lots of local radio interviews and town hall meetings.
Like a grassroots kind of vibe.
Exactly. She's trying to connect with voters on a personal level.
And what about Trump?
His campaign's taking a more combative approach. They've even denied press credentials to outlets that they see as critical of their coverage.
Wow. So it's like two completely different playbooks. One is all about connection, and the other is about control.
It's a fascinating contrast, and it really reflects the larger dynamics at play in this election.
Okay, well, we've got a lot to keep an eye on as the night goes on. Key races to watch, trends to analyze, and of course that looming question, will the losing side accept the results?
That's the million-dollar question. The stakes couldn't be higher.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with part 2 of our deep dive, so don't go anywhere.
We'll have even more insights and analysis coming your way.
All right, we are back for round 2 of our election night deep dive, and let me tell you, the tension is definitely building.
It's palpable. You can practically cut it with a knife.
I'm still glued to those live updates, but I also want to step back for a second and think about what tonight really says about American democracy.
Yeah, where we are as a country, you know?
Exactly. It's not just about who wins the White House, it's about what kind of country we're going to be.
We're seeing this clash of values playing out right in front of us, and it's fascinating and terrifying all at the same time.
It really is. And the AP VoteCast data that we were talking about earlier, it really highlights this tension between folks who are mostly concerned about the economy and those who are really worried about the future of democracy itself.
Like two different Americas facing two very different sets of challenges.
And I keep thinking about that story from our sources about the Puerto Rican voter in Philadelphia who switched their vote because of that racist joke Trump made.
Oh, yeah, that one really stuck with me.
It's like a reminder that even with these huge national narratives, it's often those individual experiences, those personal stories that can really sway things.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's those small moments, those personal decisions that end up making all the difference.
It's like those butterfly effect movies.
Well, exactly. One flap of a wing can cause a hurricane on the other side of the world.
Okay, so let's zoom back in on some specifics for a minute. Earlier, we talked about the Latinx vote in Pennsylvania's Latino belt. What's the latest on that?
Well, it's still way too early to call anything definitively, but those early indications suggest that turnout is really high in that region.
So those votes could really be decisive.
They absolutely could. It's a tight race, remember. And that Latino belt, it covers cities like Allentown, Reading, Lancaster. It's a real battleground right now.
So we'll be keeping a close eye on that for sure. You know, something else that's been fascinating to watch tonight is the role of social media in all of this.
Oh, yeah. Social media is like this whole other beast, right?
It's where so much of the conversation is happening, especially for younger voters.
It's how they get their news, how they talk about politics, how they connect with each other. But it's also a breeding ground for misinformation and division.
And we've already seen some examples of that tonight, right?
Definitely those reports of Russian interference spreading false information are really troubling. It just highlights how vulnerable we are to manipulation in this digital age.
It's a good reminder to be really careful about what we see and share online.
Absolutely. We need to be critical thinkers. Check our sources, look for multiple perspectives.
Don't just believe everything you read.
Exactly. Media literacy is more important now than ever.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about those congressional races. You mentioned earlier that those early counts were pointing towards a potential Republican takeover of both the House and the Senate.
Yeah, that's definitely still a possibility, and if those trends hold, it would be a huge power shift in Washington.
What would that mean for the next president, whoever they end up being?
It would make it really hard for them to get their agenda passed, that's for sure. We could be looking at years of gridlock.
So even if one candidate wins by a landslide, they could still face major roadblocks in Congress.
Absolutely. Congress has a lot of power, and if the opposition controls both chambers, they can really stymie the president's plans.
It's a reminder that elections aren't just about winning the White House. They're about shaping the entire political landscape.
Right, it's about the balance of power.
Okay, so it's getting late, the results are coming in, and it feels like the tension is reaching a fever pitch.
The air is thick with anticipation,
It's more than just a political contest. At this point, it feels like we're witnessing a cultural moment.
a moment of reckoning for American democracy.
And those sources we've been diving into, they really capture this sense of unease, this worry about the future of the country and the stability of our institutions.
Mhm. It's not just partisan anxieties either. It's a broader sense of uncertainty about where America is headed.
Yeah, it feels like we're at a crossroads, and the path we choose tonight will have consequences for years to come.
We're making history right now in real time, and it's both exhilarating and terrifying.
It really is. So where do we go from here? What happens after tonight? I guess we'll find out in part 3 of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, folks. The night is young.
We are back, and this is it, the final stretch of our election night deep dive. It's been a long night, but we're finally nearing the finish line.
The anticipation is killing me.
Right. But before we get to those final projections, I want to circle back to something that really struck me in those Spanish language sources.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
It's how they give us a different perspective on the anxieties surrounding the election.
You're right. There's a real sense of fear about potential unrest after the election.
And it's not just like a vague feeling either. We're talking businesses boarding up storefronts, increased security presence, a real palpable sense of unease,
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder of how divided we are as a country.
and how fragile our democracy might be. Like we saw a glimpse of that in 2020 with the refusal to accept the results and the attack on the Capitol.
It's a dark chapter in our history, and it makes you wonder, have we really learned from that?
It makes you question what this election really means for the future of American democracy.
It's not just about who wins the presidency, it's about who we are as a nation and what we stand for.
And remember those AP Votecast findings we talked about? They show that concern for democracy is a top issue for voters, right up there with the economy.
It shows that people are really worried about the state of our democracy, and rightfully so.
Like economic well-being and democratic stability go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other.
Exactly. When people lose trust in institutions, when they feel like their voices aren't being heard, it creates fertile ground for division and unrest.
And it's not just Americans who are watching all of this unfold. The whole world is holding its breath, wondering what a Harris victory or a Trump return would mean for America's global role.
Absolutely. America's leadership, its relationships with allies, its approach to foreign policy, all of that is under scrutiny tonight.
American elections have consequences far beyond our borders.
The decisions we make here at home reverberate across the globe.
So yeah, it's a lot to process.
It is, but I think we've done our best to provide our listeners with the information they need to make sense of this wild night.
We've analyzed the data, we've explored the anxieties, we've highlighted those crucial moments that might have been missed.
We've taken them on a deep dive into the heart of American democracy, warts and all.
Okay, so here we are, the moment of truth. Based on everything we've seen, who is going to be the next president of the United States?
You didn't think we were actually going to spoil the ending, did you? The journey is just as important as the destination.
That's true. But we do want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking observation.
Regardless of who wins, the big question is, will the losing side accept the results? Or will this election further deepen the divides we've seen tonight?
That's the challenge we face as a nation. And the answer will determine the course of American democracy for years to come.
It's a question worth pondering as we move forward, both individually and collectively.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.